We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The sun had not yet risen when 28-year-old elementary school teacher Melissa Garner laced her running shoes on the morning of June 12, 2006. Lake Tansbury was still wrapped in a heavy summer mist that clung to the shoreline like a veil, the kind of humidity that made even dawn feel suffocating. Residents of Bellington, North Carolina, population 3,200, were accustomed to seeing Melissa jogging along the dam road before work. She lived alone in a small second-floor apartment across from the public library, a brick building that once served as a textile office before the mill closed in the late 80s. Melissa's friends described her as disciplined, predictable, almost ritualistic in her habits. The same running route, the same blueberry protein shake afterward, the same cheerful wave to the crossing guard on Maple Street. When she failed to appear for morning assembly at Oak Ridge Elementary, her absence was noticed immediately. Principal David Irons assumed she'd been delayed by car trouble, but by 10 a.m., when her third-grade students were divided among other classes and her phone went unanswered, he called the Bellington Police Department. Officer Carla Moore was dispatched to conduct a welfare check. The apartment door was locked from the inside, chain latch engaged, windows closed, air conditioning humming steadily. Moore's knock echoed unanswered. With the landlord's key, she entered what appeared to be a perfectly undisturbed living space. Coffee cup on the counter still damp at the rim, bed neatly made, running clothes missing from the laundry basket. Melissa's car was parked in its usual spot beneath the oak tree out front. Her purse sat on the couch beside a folded lesson plan labeled Monday, Reading Comprehension, Ecosystems. Every indication suggested she had simply stepped out for her morning run and never returned. The search began within hours. By noon, sheriff's deputies, local volunteers, and off-duty teachers were combing the wooded trails around the reservoir. The air shimmered with heat and insects, cicadas droning so loudly that they swallowed shouted names. They found her water bottle 2 miles from the dam, resting upright on a bench as though deliberately placed there. Tire tracks cut through the dirt nearby but could have belonged to maintenance vehicles that patrolled the area daily. By sunset, search dogs traced Melissa's scent along the lake trail before losing it abruptly near the concrete service road leading to the dam's control building. No sign of a struggle, no discarded clothing, no blood, nothing. The following morning, Chief of Police Harold Timmons held a press conference outside the sheriff's substation, his shirt darkened with sweat. At this time, he told reporters, we have no evidence of foul play, but we are treating Miss Garner's disappearance as suspicious. The phrasing, neither hopeful nor hopeless, set the tone for what would become the most perplexing case in Bellington's history. Investigators soon focused on the peculiar condition of Melissa's apartment. The deadbolt and chain lock engaged from the inside baffled them. If she had left through the front door, she could not have relatched it without help. A maintenance hatch on the building's roof provided an alternative explanation, barely. The property manager admitted that the hatch was usually unlocked for HVAC servicing. Still, climbing down through the ceiling required a ladder, and there was no evidence anyone had entered or exited that way. The air ducts, however, caught the attention of the county crime lab. Dust samples taken from the vents contained trace residues of an industrial cleaning solvent rarely used in residential buildings, the kind employed in schools and hospitals for sterilization. The discovery would not make sense until much later, but it lodged in the evidence file like a seed waiting for proper conditions to grow. Detective Mark Kessler of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation was assigned to assist local authorities. Kessler was known for his patience, the kind of investigator who could spend hours in silence at a crime scene until the environment itself seemed to start talking. He spent 3 days reconstructing Melissa's last known movements. Security footage from a convenience store showing her buying bottled water at 9:12 p.m. the night before she vanished. An email sent to her sister at 9:46 p.m. about summer travel plans. A neighbor's report of hearing faint footsteps in the hallway around 5:30 a.m. None of it explained how a woman could vanish between her locked apartment and a public jogging trail. By the end of that first week, speculation saturated the town. Some suspected a serial offender connected to nearby college disappearances. Others whispered about an affair with a married colleague. Melissa's co-workers dismissed the gossip, insisting she was devoted to her students and had recently been nominated for a state teaching award. Her sister Rachel arrived from Asheville and transformed Melissa's apartment into an impromptu headquarters, maps, lists, phone numbers covering the kitchen walls. She slept on her sister's couch, waiting for the sound of the key turning in the door that would mean everything had been a terrible misunderstanding. That sound never came. On June 20th, 8 days after Melissa's disappearance, a kayaker discovered a single running shoe wedged between rocks near the dam's overflow channel. The laces were still tied. Forensic analysis confirmed it belonged to Melissa. Divers scoured the reservoir for 4 days, finding nothing but discarded fishing gear and old bottles. Without a body, the case hovered in limbo. No closure, no crime scene, just an absence that grew heavier with each passing season. By autumn, posters of Melissa's smiling face had faded on telephone poles and the media moved on. But Detective Kessler did not. In January 2007, he revisited Oak Ridge Elementary, where Melissa had taught. The building was undergoing renovations to its heating and ventilation systems. A faint chemical odor hung in the hallways. Kessler questioned the maintenance supervisor, a soft-spoken man named Alan Weaver, who had worked for the district since 1992. Weaver explained that the solvent used in the cleaning process was a high-strength degreaser purchased in bulk from a supplier in Raleigh. When asked whether the same product had been used in apartment complexes or other locations, he hesitated before saying that sometimes he helped with off-the-books jobs for extra cash. Cleaning vents, servicing air conditioners, nothing illegal, just side work. His answer piqued Kessler's curiosity. Records showed that Weaver had completed maintenance at Melissa's building the week before she vanished. He insisted the timing was coincidence. Forensic technicians tested Weaver's work van. They found residues matching the solvent from Melissa's vents, but nothing directly linking him to a crime. Without physical evidence or a body, the district attorney declined to file charges. The investigation cooled, then froze completely. Files were boxed, labeled, and stored in the SBI archives in Raleigh, where they would remain for over a decade. Years passed. Bellington's population grew as retirees discovered its quiet charm. New teachers filled Melissa's classroom. New families moved into her apartment building. Her sister Rachel never stopped pressing for updates. Every anniversary brought the same headline. Still missing. The case of teacher Melissa Garner. It was not until 2018, 12 years after the disappearance, that the story stirred again. Advances in forensic chemical profiling prompted a review of cold cases involving environmental residues. State analysts re-examined the dust samples from Melissa's air ducts using spectroscopic imaging unavailable in 2006. What they found astonished them. Microscopic traces of synthetic refrigerant oil mixed with DNA fragments belonging to an unknown male contributor. The oil compound was traced to a specific brand of HVAC compressor fluid discontinued in 2005, but still used by certain maintenance companies that had leftover stock, one of which was the Bellington School District. Detective Kessler, now retired but still consulting on cold cases, received a call from SBI agent Dana Whitmore. "You might want to sit down," she said. "We ran the DNA through CODIS. We got a hit." The profile matched Alan Weaver, the same maintenance supervisor questioned in 2007. He had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack, but his genetic information remained in the database due to a misdemeanor assault conviction from the 1980s. The DNA didn't prove murder. It only proved presence. Still, it was enough to reopen the file. Whitmore's team began reconstructing Weaver's movements during the week of June 12, 2006. Payroll records showed that he clocked out at 4:15 p.m. on June 11th. Yet a security camera at Oak Ridge Elementary captured his van returning to the maintenance lot at 6:02 a.m. the next morning, the exact time Melissa would have been finishing her run near the dam. When investigators examined the digital archives of the school district's HVAC system, they discovered something chilling. A remote timer adjustment logged at 5:51 a.m. on June 12, 2006, manually overriding the air circulation in Melissa's apartment complex. The maintenance server used the same software for both school buildings and residential contracts. The override originated from Weaver's login credentials. The pattern became clear. Weaver had exploited his access to the ventilation system to enter Melissa's apartment through the roof maintenance hatch, under the pretense of servicing equipment. When Melissa returned from her run, he was already inside. The chemical residue on the vents came from the solvent he used to wipe his fingerprints. The locked chain had been relatched from the inside before he exited through the duct access. Maneuver possible only to someone familiar with the building's layout. The motive, investigators concluded, was sexual assault, though Weaver's death meant the full truth would never be told. In March 2019, ground-penetrating radar surveys around Lake Tansbury located an anomaly beneath the soil near the dam's overflow path. Excavation crews uncovered skeletal remains wrapped in deteriorated industrial insulation material, identical to the kind stored in the school district's maintenance warehouse. Dental records confirmed the identity of Melissa Garner. The discovery transformed a 12-year mystery into a homicide investigation that would redefine how small departments approached cold cases. The community's reaction was swift and emotional. Candlelight vigils filled the town square. The elementary school renamed its library in Melissa's memory, and Rachel Garner spoke at the dedication ceremony, her voice steady despite years of waiting. "My sister believed in teaching children to look closer," she said. She wanted them to see the difference between what seems safe and what truly is. For investigators, the case became a textbook example of persistence meeting technology. The HVAC timer logs, once dismissed as irrelevant maintenance data, had preserved the precise moment the crime occurred. The chemical residue that baffled the 2006 lab had, in the end, told the story Weaver never could. The dam where Melissa vanished became both a memorial and a warning, its calm waters concealing the echoes of a summer morning when trust evaporated like mist at sunrise. And somewhere in the archives of the State Bureau of Investigation, inside a folder labeled Garner Melissa, Case Closed, a note written by Detective Kessler remains paperclipped to the final report. It reads, "She never stopped running. We just finally caught up." The town of Bellington never fully recovered from the revelation that the man responsible for Melissa Garner's disappearance had been a fixture in the community for decades. For nearly 12 years, Alan Weaver had fixed broken thermostats, replaced air filters, and shaken hands at PTA meetings. He had been inside every school building, every maintenance room, and even many residents' homes during after-hours repair calls. His face was ordinary, his routine unremarkable, and that ordinariness was precisely what allowed him to remain invisible. When the truth emerged in 2019, it shattered the illusion that Bellington's trust had ever been earned. Detective Dana Whitmore led the task force that reclassified the case from missing person to homicide, closed by exceptional clearance. But for her and for former Detective Mark Kessler, closure was an illusion, a bureaucratic word for a wound that would never properly heal. Kessler returned to Bellington for the press conference announcing the identification of Melissa's remains. Reporters crowded into the small town hall. Cameras trained on a podium flanked by two easels, one showing Melissa's graduation portrait, the other a map of Lake Tansbury with red markers indicating excavation points. Whitmore recited the sequence of events, the timeline of evidence, the DNA match, the discovery site. When a reporter asked whether Weaver could have had accomplices, she hesitated only briefly before saying there was no indication anyone else was involved. But Kessler, standing in the back of the room with his hat in his hands, wasn't convinced. In the weeks following the announcement, he revisited his old case notes. Something about Weaver's profile didn't fully align with the precision of the crime scene. The locked apartment, the meticulous staging, the timed HVAC override, these were not the improvisations of a man committing a spontaneous act of violence. They suggested premeditation and technical competence that went beyond routine maintenance. Kessler spent sleepless nights at his kitchen table, rereading interview transcripts, particularly those from Weaver's co-workers. One line, overlooked for years, suddenly stood out. A former apprentice had mentioned that Weaver sometimes borrowed login credentials from another employee when testing system updates. The employee's name was Samuel Dyer, the district's technology coordinator responsible for the digital control interface linking all HVAC systems. Dyer had left the district in 2008 to work for a private contractor in Raleigh. Kessler called Agent Whitmore, his voice tight with the urgency of rediscovered obsession. "You need to look at Dyer," he said. If Weaver had help with those timers, Dyer would have known. Within days, Whitmore's team subpoenaed the 2006 server logs from the district's IT archive. The data, stored on obsolete backup drives, took weeks to recover. When they did, the logs confirmed that on June 12, 2006, two separate user credentials had accessed the system within 5 minutes of each other, Weavers and Dyers. The revelation complicated the narrative that had already been neatly packaged for public consumption. If Dyer had assisted, intentionally or otherwise, the case was not as closed as everyone believed. Whitmore authorized a background investigation. Dyer's record was spotless. No criminal history, consistent employment, married with 2 children, a homeowner in a quiet Raleigh suburb. Yet metadata from his district email account suggested late-night communication with Weaver during the spring of 2006, messages discussing ventilation software, calibration, and off-grid overrides. The tone was professional but secretive, implying unauthorized experimentation with the control network. When questioned, Dyer initially dismissed the emails as routine maintenance correspondence. But when presented with the recovered logs showing his credentials active during the morning of Melissa's disappearance, his composure faltered. Allen handled the fieldwork, he insisted. If my account was used, he must have logged in remotely. Forensic analysts, however, traced the login's IP address to a home computer registered to Dyer's residence at the time. The implication was devastating. While Weaver may have physically carried out the crime, Dyer's remote manipulation of the ventilation controls had enabled the illusion of impossibility. He had likely assisted in locking the apartment from within by triggering the chain latch mechanism through an air pressure test routine that briefly engaged the ventilation system's interior suction vents, a diagnostic function never intended for such use. Dyer denied understanding the consequences of his code, but investigators found a deleted chat exchange where Weaver thanked him for helping make the test look perfect. That digital footprint rewrote the story the town had already tried to bury. Prosecutors reopened the case, framing Dyer's role as accessory after the fact by digital means, an unprecedented classification in North Carolina law enforcement. The reemergence of the case reignited local trauma. Teachers who had worked with Melissa found themselves reliving that summer of confusion and fear. The dam trail, once a favorite running route, became a site of nightly vigils and whispered speculation. Rachel Garner attended every court hearing, sitting in the first row with a photo of her sister on her lap. She told reporters that she wanted to see the systems of complacency held accountable, the administrators who ignored early warning signs, the investigators who dismissed chemical traces as anomalies, the community that assumed safety without evidence. At trial, prosecutors presented Dyer's digital fingerprints like forensic DNA, time-stamped logins, encrypted backups, fragments of deleted code. Expert witnesses reconstructed the HVAC override in real time, showing how a simple sequence could relock a door chain through air pressure and suction mechanics. The courtroom audience gasped as diagrams displayed how invisible technology had become an accomplice. Dyer maintained that he had no knowledge of Weaver's intentions, claiming he believed they were testing security updates for the district's summer renovation program. But his indifference to the aftermath and his attempt to erase correspondence weighed heavily against him. After 8 days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of obstruction and reckless endangerment resulting in death. The sentence, 15 years, was symbolic rather than satisfying. Rachel told the press she didn't want vengeance, only honesty. When the verdict was read, Kessler stood outside the courthouse watching rain wash across the steps. He felt no victory, only exhaustion. The townspeople who had once celebrated Melissa's discovery now faced another revelation, that evil had not been solitary but systemic, woven through negligence, secrecy, and a culture of quiet trust. Bellington's mayor commissioned a memorial near the dam, a bronze silhouette of a running woman facing east toward sunrise, engraved with the words, "Truth travels slower than water, but it reaches the shore." In 2020, Agent Whitmore authored a training manual titled Environmental Forensics in Digital Infrastructure, using the Garner case as the foundation. The study became required reading for investigators dealing with closed environments and smart systems. It detailed how overlooked maintenance data could serve as silent witnesses, how air ducts could tell stories that human eyes could not. The manual's preface carried a dedication line in Kessler's handwriting, "For Melissa, who taught us to look closer." By the 5th anniversary of the case's resolution, the community had begun to heal in subtle ways. The school's HVAC system was replaced entirely, the dam trail renamed Garner Loop, and a scholarship established for aspiring teachers in environmental science. Rachel moved back to Asheville but returned every June to run her sister's route at dawn. She described it not as remembrance but reclamation, taking back a space once stolen by fear. The fog over Lake Tansbury still rolled in thick every summer morning, but now, instead of silence, there were footsteps on the gravel, steady and rhythmic, echoing through the mist like proof that life continues after the unthinkable. Detective Kessler retired permanently in 2021, but sometimes he visited the dam before sunrise, parking his truck near the trailhead. He'd sit with coffee cooling in his hands, listening to the hum of the rebuilt turbines beneath the concrete. He once told Whitmore that what haunted him wasn't the horror of what Weaver and Dyer had done, but how long it took everyone to notice the patterns hiding in plain sight. The case was never about monsters, he said. It was about how ordinary people ignore strange things until they become tragedy. In the final archived entry of the State Bureau's file, Whitmore added a note before sealing the case. No system is truly silent. We simply have to learn how to hear it. By 2022, 6 years after the lake excavation and 3 since the conviction of Samuel Dyer, Bellington, North Carolina had returned to an uneasy quiet. The town's name no longer drew the media vans that once clogged its single main road. But the shadow of Melissa Garner's disappearance had become part of its identity, whispered about in classrooms, coffee shops, and the newly renamed Garner Loop Trail. Tourists jogged along the dam unaware that they were treading ground where an entire community's innocence had drowned. Locals called it the lake lesson, a phrase shorthand for vigilance, the quiet acknowledgement that evil could wear a janitor's badge or a neighbor's smile. The elementary school had a new ventilation system, its hum constant and sterile, as if the machinery itself was reminding everyone that air could hide secrets. Detective Mark Kessler spent his retirement in a modest cottage near the edge of town, living alone with his case files boxed in a spare room. He'd promised Whitmore that he was finished with investigations, but unfinished stories tugged at him like echoes. Each morning he walked the shoreline, collecting discarded fishing lures and watching the mist rise off Lake Tansbury, the same mist that had swallowed Melissa all those years ago. On June 12, 2022, he found a bouquet of lilies tied to the memorial plaque, the card unsigned except for a single line written in a teacher's neat cursive, "Still running." He knew Rachel had been there at dawn. She came every year, always before sunrise, always leaving flowers that wilted by afternoon heat. Rachel lived in Asheville now, teaching environmental science at a charter school. She spoke occasionally at conferences about data ethics and forensic persistence, using her sister's case as a cautionary tale. Her talks drew packed auditoriums, audiences fascinated by how a maintenance log and a forgotten solvent sample had solved what once seemed unsolvable. Yet after each lecture, she retreated to her car and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel until the memories subsided. She told friends she felt caught between gratitude and grief, thankful for closure, haunted by the image of Melissa's shoe by the dam, its laces still tied. Agent Dana Whitmore had been promoted to Assistant Director of the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit. Her office walls were lined with maps and photos, but the Garner case held a prominent place. A framed photograph of Lake Tansbury at sunrise, and a brass nameplate that read, "Lesson in Persistence." She continued refining forensic methods born from the investigation, digital residue mapping, aerosolized contaminant tracking, microparticulate time stamping. These once experimental techniques were now standard in environmental crime analysis. Whitmore gave lectures across the country, teaching younger agents how to see data not as numbers but as behavior frozen in code. Whenever she spoke of the Garner case, she repeated Kessler's words, "No system is silent." Meanwhile, the town itself began transforming the tragedy into something resembling legacy. The Bellington Public Library hosted an annual scholarship fundraiser called the Garner Run, where participants jogged the 3-mile loop around the lake wearing bibs printed with Melissa's photo. Proceeds funded education programs for young women entering STEM fields. Local businesses displayed small placards reading, "Remember, report, re-examine," the slogan Rachel had designed after the trial. Children growing up in Bellington learned the story in fragments. The teacher who vanished, the air ducts, the truth found years later. They didn't know the details, but they knew to lock their doors and to speak up when something felt off. In autumn 2023, while reorganizing archived evidence for digitization, A technician in Raleigh discovered a mislabeled flash drive sealed in one of the Garner case boxes. It contained encrypted data copied from the 2006 HVAC control network. The file name suggested system diagnostics, but deeper analysis revealed a hidden subfolder labeled Test Alpha 06. Inside were screenshots of the air pressure model Weaver and Dyer had used during their so-called calibration experiments. Metadata showed the last modification occurred hours after Melissa vanished. The images included diagrams of apartment layouts, airflow patterns, and, most chillingly, a labeled floor plan of Melissa's exact unit, apartment 2B. Someone had known precisely where she lived. Whitmore reopened the archived drive for verification. It confirmed Dyer's earlier denial was incomplete. He hadn't merely supplied code. He had mapped the physical environment, providing Weaver with digital blueprints. Though the discovery had no legal consequence, Dyer remained incarcerated. It deepened the understanding of how the crime had evolved. Not spontaneous, but engineered like a technical project. Whitmore added the findings to her updated case file, noting that the Garner homicide had become a precedent cited in over 20 similar investigations nationwide. Kessler visited her office that winter. His hair was silver now, his gait slowed by arthritis, but his eyes still carried the same intensity that had once unnerved witnesses. "You're still teaching her story," he said quietly, nodding toward the photograph of Melissa. Whitmore smiled. "It's not her story anymore," she replied. "It's every investigator's reminder that details speak even when people don't." They talked for hours about advances in forensic aerosol analysis, about AI models capable of reconstructing indoor air movement, about the fragile thread that connects data to truth. When Kessler left, he handed Whitmore a small notebook filled with sketches and quotes. On the first page he'd written, "The case is solved, but not finished." That spring, Rachel returned to Bellington to oversee the final phase of the memorial park by the lake. The town had allocated funds to install educational plaques explaining the science behind the investigation, how dust, chemicals, and code had testified when witnesses failed. During the dedication ceremony, she read from Melissa's last known email to her. "Summer's coming fast. I feel like everything's about to change." Rachel paused, her voice steady but soft. "It did," she said. "And we did." After the crowd dispersed, she walked the trail alone, stopping where the path curved near the dam overflow. The air was thick with honeysuckle and the faint mechanical hum of the turbines. For a moment she thought she saw movement across the water, a figure jogging through the mist, the rhythm of footsteps familiar. She knew it was an illusion, a trick of light and memory, but she let it linger. Closure, she realized, wasn't a door that shut. It was air flowing through old vents, carrying the stories of those who refused to vanish. In 2025, on the 19th anniversary of the disappearance, the State Bureau released a documentary case file for internal training titled The Garner Protocol. Its final segment featured Kessler's recorded interview, his voice gravelly with age. "We thought we were chasing a ghost, but what we were really chasing was our own blindness. Technology didn't solve the case. People did. People who finally listened to what the evidence had been whispering all along." The recording ended with him quoting Melissa's student's motto, carved into the school library wall. "Ask why, ask again, never stop asking." That night in Bellington, the sky turned violet over Lake Tansbury. Streetlights reflected on the water like scattered lanterns. The new ventilation system at Oak Ridge Elementary hummed quietly, a different tone now, clean, precise, purposeful. Somewhere in the circuitry, a sensor clicked on, measuring airflow, ensuring balance, its data streaming silently into the cloud where, perhaps, the echoes of a teacher's last breath had finally transformed into something that could keep others safe. And in the darkened office of the school's night janitor, above the quiet rows of desks, hung a framed quote donated by Rachel Garner. "Truth circulates, like air. It never disappears. It only waits to be felt." By the summer of 2026, Lake Tansbury had become both pilgrimage and warning. Travelers from across the country stopped at the memorial park dedicated to Melissa Garner, tracing their fingers along the engraved names of those who had joined the yearly Garner Run. News crews occasionally revisited the site to film updates on the town that had transformed its deepest wound into a lesson in forensic evolution. Bellington's population had swelled slightly with new residents drawn by the story's notoriety, a strange form of tourism built around tragedy. Yet those who had lived through the original disappearance carried an unspoken fatigue, a quiet resistance to turning pain into spectacle. The lake was beautiful again, but its beauty felt rehearsed, like a crime scene that had been carefully staged for the camera. Rachel Garner had learned to live between two worlds, the rational and the haunted. She spent her days teaching high schoolers about the physics of air currents and the chemistry of environmental toxins, the same invisible elements that had ultimately solved her sister's case. But nights were different. Nights she found herself replaying the timeline, calculating the 43 minutes that changed everything. Sometimes she imagined Melissa still out there, frozen in that loop of time between leaving the apartment and vanishing into the mist. On anniversaries, she wrote letters addressed to her sister but never mailed, pages filled with questions no investigation could ever answer. Who unlocked the final door? Did she understand what was happening? Did she know that someone would spend 16 years refusing to stop? In Raleigh, Assistant Director Whitmore continued to expand the cold case division. The Garner Protocol had become a national model for integrating digital infrastructure into crime analysis. New recruits were trained to treat HVAC systems, water lines, and electrical grids as witnesses, networks that observed without bias and preserved traces long after human memory failed. Whitmore kept Kessler's notebook on her desk, its worn leather cover marked with coffee stains and fingerprints. She often opened it when new cases threatened to consume her team, reading his line, "Patience is the shape of justice when truth moves slower than grief." It reminded her that closure was never instantaneous. It arrived in fragments, like data packets waiting to be reassembled. That August, a regional news outlet aired an anniversary documentary titled The Vanishing Lesson, The Garner Case 20 Years Later. The producers interviewed former students who remembered Melissa as the teacher who made science feel like storytelling. One woman, now a forensic analyst herself, said she had chosen her career because of the mystery that made our town afraid of air. The documentary ended with aerial footage of Lake Tansbury at dawn, the camera gliding over still water while Rachel's voice narrated, "Justice isn't about finding what's hidden. It's about learning why we stopped looking." The broadcast drew national attention again, and with it came renewed scrutiny. Internet forums reignited debates about whether Samuel Dyer had acted alone, whether Weaver had committed other crimes, whether Bellington itself had buried additional secrets beneath its polite silence. Mark Kessler watched the program from his living room, television glow reflecting off stacks of old case folders. He was 81 now, frail but lucid, the edges of memory softened yet intact. After the credits rolled, he rose slowly, walked to his back porch, and stared out at the line of trees that bordered the lake. He still lived in Bellington. He couldn't leave the town that had shaped his life's work. Sometimes younger detectives visited him for advice, drawn by his reputation as the man who never gave up. He always told them the same thing. Don't fall in love with the mystery. Fall in love with the evidence. That night he opened his window and let the sound of the turbines hum through the room, an old mechanical lullaby that reminded him of both loss and accomplishment. He fell asleep in his chair, the case file open on his lap like a book that refused to close. In early 2027, Whitmore received a call from an engineer at the North Carolina Department of Water Resources. During routine dam maintenance, workers had discovered a sealed metal locker embedded in the concrete substructure of the overflow tunnel, a space that hadn't been accessed since the dam's expansion in 2005. Inside were several corroded tools, an old flashlight, and a maintenance logbook signed AW. The logbook's entries corresponded to the weeks leading up to Melissa's disappearance. But near the back, a final page contained coordinates scribbled in a trembling hand, along with a single sentence. Test successful, air follows silence. The handwriting matched Weaver's personnel forms. Though the locker's contents added no new crimes, it deepened the psychological portrait of a man obsessed with control, someone who viewed the manipulation of airflow as a kind of art. The discovery reaffirmed what Kessler and Whitmore had long suspected, that the murder was an experiment in invisibility as much as an act of violence. When the news reached Rachel, she didn't cry. She simply folded the article and placed it in her sister's memorial journal, writing beneath it, "He wanted silence." We gave her a voice. She no longer visited the trial records or autopsy photos. Instead, she focused on the living legacy, the scholarship students, the investigative interns who now treated the Garner Protocol as their foundation. In 2028, she published a book called Invisible Evidence, A Sister's Journey Through the Air Between Truth and Memory. It combined memoir with forensic analysis, blending grief and science into something quietly revolutionary. The final chapter ended with a single line. I learned that the spaces between molecules hold not emptiness, but witness. That same year, Whitmore retired from the Bureau, her final act to declassify portions of the Garner file for public research. She attended a farewell ceremony where she and Kessler, both gray-haired and slow-moving, were honored with plaques shaped like open books. He whispered to her during the applause. You know, if Melissa could see all this, she'd ask for extra credit. Whitmore laughed through tears. The two of them walked together to the parking lot, standing for a long time beneath the humid Carolina sky. You ever wonder if we finally did enough? She asked. Kessler nodded toward the distant glow of the dam lights. Justice isn't measured in answers, he said. It's measured in who keeps asking. By 2030, the Garner Run had evolved into a statewide initiative funding forensic education and victim advocacy programs. Drones filmed each year's sunrise start, thousands of runners moving in synchronized rhythm along the dam, their breaths rising like mist, the living echo of one woman's final run. Bellington had changed too. New shops, renovated schools, murals celebrating science and empathy. The tragedy had transformed into heritage, and heritage into vigilance. On a quiet July evening that year, Rachel visited the lake one last time. The air smelled of ozone and honeysuckle, the turbines humming beneath her feet. She placed her hand on the bronze silhouette of her sister and whispered, "You change the air we breathe." As the sky shifted from violet to black, the wind moved through the memorial trees, leaves rustling like a chorus of faint voices. Somewhere beyond the dam, thunder rolled. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, washing the path clean once more. And when the storm passed, the air over Lake Tansbury carried the scent of renewal, a mixture of metal and rain and memory. The mist returned, low and silver, wrapping the water in quiet. Anyone standing there might have sworn they heard footsteps on gravel, rhythmic and light, disappearing into the dawn. By the time the calendar turned to 2032, Lake Tansbury had become a kind of modern folklore, the site where detectives brought trainees to learn the boundary between what can be proven and what can only be remembered. The Bureau's new Forensic Simulation Center stood on a rise overlooking the dam. Its atrium held a permanent exhibit titled The Air Remembers, showing cross-sections of HVAC ducts, samples of solvent residue, and a looping holographic projection of dust particles moving through a shaft of light. School children filed through on field trips clutching tablets that explained how temperature, air pressure, and code once conspired to hide a human being. To them, Melissa Garner was no longer just a victim, but the reason they trusted data over assumption. Rachel attended the opening ceremony as guest of honor. She wore her sister's old locket and spoke to the crowd in the same calm, deliberate cadence that Melissa had used in class. "Science doesn't heal grief," she said, "but it gives grief direction." Her speech drew a standing ovation, yet afterward she slipped away from the photographers and walked down to the shoreline, the same path she had taken every year since the discovery. The waterline had receded after years of drought, exposing stones that hadn't seen sunlight since the early 2000s. She crouched, touched one, and whispered, "You've been waiting longer than any of us." Inside the center, Agent Emeritus Whitmore guided new recruits through a reconstruction lab where airflow models played out in real time. She had returned to service as a consultant, unable to let go completely. Kessler's notebook sat under glass in the corner, open to his final entry. "Evidence is the memory of places." A plaque beneath it explained how one man's obsession had evolved into an entire discipline. Visitors often lingered there longest, staring at the cramped handwriting that once chased ghosts through a small Carolina town. Kessler himself had passed away quietly in his sleep the previous winter. The news reached Bellington the morning after a heavy frost, and the town's church bells tolled for him at noon. At his request, his ashes were scattered along the Garner Loop Trail. Whitmore and Rachel walked the path together that day, saying nothing. When they reached the dam overlook, Whitmore read from a note she had found tucked inside his notebook. "If I could run again, I'd follow her path until the air turned clear. They let the ashes fall into the wind. The particles shimmered briefly, then vanished into the same mist that had once taken Melissa. After Kessler's death, Whitmore dedicated herself to completing a project he had begun, a digital archive of unresolved environmental crimes. Using machine learning, she trained a model to cross-reference chemical residues, maintenance records, and digital infrastructure anomalies. The system was capable of identifying patterns invisible to human investigators. The Bureau named it KesslerNet. Within months, it had reopened 7 dormant cases across 3 states. Each time a cold file found new life, Whitmore sent Rachel a message. She's still teaching us. In 2033, Rachel's book, Invisible Evidence, was adapted into a documentary series for the public broadcast network. She hesitated before signing the rights, afraid of reducing tragedy to entertainment. But the producers promised accuracy over drama. The premiere aired nationwide on June 12th, exactly 27 years after Melissa's disappearance. Viewers watched drone footage of the lake, interviews with Whitmore, and archival audio of Kessler recounting the first day of the investigation. The final scene showed Rachel standing by the memorial at sunrise saying, "Justice doesn't erase silence, it turns it into echo." The series won awards, but Rachel avoided the spotlight. She donated her earnings to the Garner Foundation, funding scholarships for rural women entering forensic science. By 2035, Bellington's skyline had changed again. Solar panels lined the rooftops of the elementary school. The old library had been converted into the Garner Research Annex, hosting seminars on environmental criminology. The town slogan on the welcome sign now read, "Where the air tells the truth." Tour buses still came, but they did so respectfully. Locals no longer flinched when outsiders mentioned the case. Instead, they pointed to the lake with a measured pride. The story had transformed from wound to warning, from warning to wisdom. Rachel, now in her early 50s, continued teaching. She told her students that every space holds information if you learn how to listen. The way dust settles, the way a motor hums, the way silence lingers after movement stops. She kept a small glass vial on her desk filled with air collected from Lake Tansbury the morning the memorial opened. It was sealed, invisible, weightless, but to her it contained everything: grief, endurance, proof. That autumn, during a faculty retreat, she received a message from Whitmore marked urgent. The Bureau's new algorithm had flagged an anomaly in one of the earliest Garner case backups, an unexamined metadata fragment from the 2006 air quality sensor logs. The timestamp read 05:32 a.m., 8 minutes before Melissa was last seen alive. The data showed a sudden, localized spike in carbon dioxide concentration followed by a brief drop in barometric pressure. Whitmore's accompanying note said simply, "She wasn't alone in that apartment." The reading implied breathing irregularities from more than one person during those final minutes, evidence not of a single intruder but of a confrontation, perhaps a struggle that had been silently recorded by the system's environmental monitor. Rachel spent nights rereading the report, her mind racing between comfort and terror. The finding didn't change the outcome, but it added a human dimension she had long avoided. Melissa fighting back, alive, aware. She walked the trail again the next morning, the first frost of the year crisp beneath her shoes, and imagined her sister's final breaths, not as surrender but defiance. For the first time, she smiled through the ache. The Bureau released an updated case brief acknowledging the new data but maintaining the same conclusion: homicide resolved. Yet within investigative circles, the revelation sparked a new field of study: respiratory event analytics, using ambient sensors to reconstruct moments before death. Whitmore joked that Melissa had become the patron saint of airflow. Rachel didn't laugh, but she understood. Science had given her sister something rare in death: participation. In 2036, on the 30th anniversary of the disappearance, the town held a dawn ceremony at the dam. Hundreds gathered as the turbines slowed, silencing the constant hum for the first time in decades. The quiet felt enormous, a living monument. Rachel stepped to the microphone and said, "She taught children to see what was hidden. Now the world sees because of her." As the crowd bowed their heads, a soft wind rose from the lake, moving through the crowd like breath itself. It lifted the edges of programs, stirred hair and tears alike, then settled back into stillness. When the turbines resumed, the sound was softer, less mechanical, as if the machines themselves acknowledged the moment. The sun broke over the horizon, cutting through the mist in long gold beams. Rachel closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm of the air, the one sound that had never left her, the whisper that began everything. That night, the Bureau's archive server recorded a scheduled system update. The file name was automatic, generated by KesslerNet's learning algorithm. Garner Lake Final Sync. The timestamp, 000, June 13, 2036. Its metadata note read, Case integrity verified. Status preserved. And so, in the language of machines, Melissa Garner's story ended. Not erased, not forgotten, but suspended in the endless circulation of data and breath, where truth, at last, could breathe freely. By 2040, the lake had become part of the curriculum. High school textbooks across North Carolina included a unit titled The Garner Anomaly, using the case to teach data ethics, forensic persistence, and the psychology of small-town silence. Children who hadn't been born when Melissa disappeared could recite the timeline by heart: the morning run, the locked apartment, the air ducts, the confession. To them, the story wasn't tragedy, but transformation, the moment when human intuition began listening to invisible systems. At the new Kessler Whitmore Institute for Forensic Science in Raleigh, students practiced simulations based on the case. They learned to read air movement like language, to interpret dust residue as punctuation. The laboratories hummed with quiet reverence, and every year on June 12th, the faculty gathered at dawn to release white balloons marked with the words, "Still running." Rachel Garner attended the first few ceremonies, then watched remotely as the tradition grew. She'd moved to a small cabin near Boone where the air was thinner, cleaner. She called it her laboratory of quiet. From there, she consulted on forensic ethics boards, reviewing proposals that balanced technological power with human sensitivity. The question isn't what we can find, she'd tell them. It's what we're ready to hear. In 2042, the Bureau transferred the entire Garner file, millions of documents, recordings, sensor logs, to the National Digital Archive, preserving it as the first case formally recognized as data heritage. The files were accessible to the public, and within months researchers began discovering patterns that no one had seen before. Repeated timestamps suggesting someone had remotely accessed the HVAC network days before the murder, geolocation pings from an unknown auxiliary modem registered to a defunct contractor. The finding reignited interest in whether Weaver had acted entirely alone. Whitmore, now in her 70s but still serving as consultant emeritus, reviewed the new data personally. Her conclusion was cautious. While the evidence confirmed external access, it didn't necessarily mean a conspiracy, only that the infrastructure of truth had deeper roots than any single person. We built systems, she told a symposium that year, and the systems were watching us back. Rachel watched her from the audience. Afterward, they sat together in the lobby, two women who had spent most of their lives orbiting the same silence. Do you ever think it's finished? Rachel asked. Whitmore smiled tiredly. Justice isn't a line you cross, she said. It's a loop you keep walking until the air clears. They hugged goodbye knowing it might be their last conversation. Whitmore passed away 3 months later, her ashes scattered beside Kessler's on the trail. A single brass plaque joined theirs. She listened to what silence was saying. The town of Bellington had become almost unrecognizable. The population had tripled. Biotech firms occupied the outskirts, drawn by the Institute's research corridor. Yet the original downtown still held the old diner, Roscoe's, where locals gathered every June to tell younger generations how it had all started, with one woman running into fog and never coming home. They spoke of her not as a ghost, but as a constant. The dam lights now shone blue at night, symbolizing vigilance. The turbines had been replaced with silent, energy-efficient models, their hum preserved only in recordings used for museum exhibits. The absence of sound felt like the town's final gesture of respect. Rachel spent those years writing again, this time a book titled The Breath Archive. It wasn't about the case, but about memory itself, how grief metabolizes into knowledge, how silence becomes evidence, how air carries stories that bodies can't. Reviewers called it both scientific and sacred. She toured universities reluctantly, repeating her central thesis: everything we lose leaves a pattern behind. It's our job to listen for it. In 2045, on the 39th anniversary of Melissa's death, the Bureau invited Rachel to witness the final sealing of the Garner evidence vault. It would be cryogenically preserved for another century under the Data Heritage Act. She stood in a white room filled with misted nitrogen, watching as technicians lowered digital drives into titanium casings. One of them turned to her and said softly, "Ma'am, this is the last time anyone will see these files until 2145. Rachel nodded. "That's fine," she whispered. "By then, the air will have told the rest." She returned to Boone afterward and lived quietly, tending a garden and mentoring students online. Each morning she opened the window to let fresh air circulate through her cabin, a ritual she called "my sister's reminder." When storms rolled through the mountains, she would pause whatever she was doing to listen to the wind shift, hearing in it the old turbines of Tansbury, the echo of footsteps in snow, the pulse of time moving forward. In 2048, a research student from the Institute visited her with a strange request. The Bureau's algorithm, KesslerNet, had evolved into a fully autonomous system capable of drawing inferential connections across unrelated archives. It had recently produced an unprompted entry labeled "Garner Continuation, Pattern Detected." Inside were snippets of air quality data from a new case in Oregon showing identical fluctuations to those in Melissa's apartment logs. The same drop in barometric pressure, the same oxygen signature indicating 2 overlapping respiration patterns. The student asked Rachel whether she believed the machine was haunted. Rachel smiled faintly. "Not haunted," she said. "Trained." The air taught it to notice. The Oregon case resolved quickly. An attempted abduction stopped because investigators recognized the pattern in time. The newspapers called it the Garner Save. For the first time, Melissa's name appeared not beside tragedy, but prevention. When Rachel read the headline, she wept quietly. Her sister's story had finally reversed its trajectory, from loss to warning, from warning to rescue. The air had learned. By 2050, Rachel's health had begun to fail. She was 67, her lungs scarred from years of chemical exposure during early fieldwork. She joked that it was poetic. "The air that saved others is what's taking me home." That spring, she asked to be taken one last time to Lake Tansbury. The Bureau arranged a small private ceremony at dawn. The lake was different now, cleaner, smaller, but still holding its perpetual fog. Rachel sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes closed, listening. "It sounds like her," she murmured. "Always did." Before she died that August, she left a sealed letter for the Institute. It contained a single instruction. "When the vault opens in 2145, release this with it." Inside was a simple message written in blue ink, the same kind Melissa had once used to grade papers. "If you are reading this, then time has done what justice could not. Remember that air does not forget. Everything you breathe was once someone's story. Treat it gently." After her passing, the Institute established the Garner Fellowship in her name, funding interdisciplinary research between atmospheric science and criminology. The motto engraved above the entrance read, "Every molecule remembers." By the time the century turned, the Garner case existed only in archives, simulations, and the pulse of algorithms tracing patterns across the digital sky. Yet somewhere in the depths of Lake Tansbury, sensors installed decades earlier still transmitted environmental data every hour. Humidity, air pressure, temperature, records of a landscape that refused to stop telling its story. Late at night, when the wind blew across the dam, residents said you could still hear a faint rhythm beneath it, the steady cadence of a woman's footsteps, moving endlessly forward, as if still running toward the next breath of truth.